Well, Chris, welcome, and welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of the Connor Group Breakthrough Work podcast. We're live and on site in Salt Lake City, Utah, and this podcast is going to focus on companies and individuals that have achieved breakthroughs. Really honing in on those pivotal moments where those breakthroughs are really driven. These could be career changes, corporate milestones, or major achievements. So, given this is our first episode, I'll introduce myself. I'm Ravi Kumar, partner and national market leader at Connor Group. Chris, you know this, but Connor Group is a specialized professional services and leading advisory firm. We've worked with over 2,000 companies, ambitious companies over our 20-year history as a firm across technology, life sciences, and high-growth industries. And we've actually taken over 250 companies public, and those companies are now worth over $3 trillion in aggregate market cap. So very excited for you to be here. Chris, you and I have known each other for a long time, but for our audience, can you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your company?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ravi, and thanks for making me a part of this inaugural podcast for sure. So Chris Lowe, I'm the CEO at a company called Nusano. I've spent my life in biotech, primarily been really fortunate to have been a part of 5 companies and 5 IPOs. And also those same companies took 5 different therapeutics to FDA approval. So if nothing else, I'm good at picking smart people to hang out with, is the way I look at it. And really, looking back, I mean, the life in biotech, I couldn't have picked anything. It's tough, but I couldn't have picked anything different. It's really a blessing to be a part of people that are touching lives in so many different ways.
No, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more about Nusano and, all the verticals that you guys are touching. We'll maybe kick it off, given we're both, you're a former finance guy. I like to say I'm a businessman trapped in an accountant's body. But, given your technical training is in accounting and finance, as you mentioned, you've been CFO, C-suite at, 5 other companies that you've taken public. This is your first CEO role. So talk about that breakthrough going from the finance side of the house to the CEO side of the house.
Yeah, I think, for me, probably one of the biggest things I always appreciated about the CFO role was that you have the unique burden of having the vision of the whole playing field, number one. But you also have the responsibility to kind of know when to poke your nose into things and more importantly, when not to. And, and your job is not to be the chief, I told you so, or anything like that, but the enabler. And so, those thoughts always kind of, I think, served me well in terms of being a part of really good teams and hopefully playing a role to make those teams successful. So that skill set, maybe with a little bit of critical thinking, I think, served me well. That I was always a good partner, a good business partner to, to the whole C-suite and to my CEOs along the way. And especially once you get in the public domain, I mean, the responsibility that's on the CFO role is significant, and you're dealing with investors, compliance, et cetera. And I just kind of always looked at it from the business side that a good CFO should be able to handle a conversation by themselves for, about 20 to 30 minutes was always my benchmark. After that, I was probably over my skis scientifically and kind of needed to have, somebody else along for the ride. But all those reasons, I think they've prepped me well for this role now.
Oh, that's awesome. And you mentioned earlier that you've taken 5 companies public in a C-suite capacity, most as a CFO. Your one company that you took public in 2009, Anthera, you took a unique approach to fundraising and you kind of, let's call it the pre-deal roadshow approach. You want to talk a little bit about the position you put your insiders in ahead of the roadshow?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I mean, first and foremost, I had a great CEO there who was an out-of-the-box thinker. Yeah. Now, out-of-the-box thinking, from a venture capitalist point of view, is sometimes code for, man, you're a pain in the ass. But yeah. He really elevated my critical thinking. And so we did a couple of things. Number one, obviously during the financial crisis going back, starting in 2008, while most companies were ceasing travel and ceasing those, investor visits because they knew fundraising was drying up, we actually took the approach, we just kept doing it. And what happened was that we would end up with more time than usual with some really relevant people at, Deerfield and Fidelity and OrbiMed, et cetera,
Yeah.
names that we all know and love.
Absolutely.
So instead of being jammed for a 26-minute meeting there, sometimes we would spend 2 or 3 hours, with them. And we weren't fundraising,
Yeah.
but we were building credibility of telling them what we were going to do, going out and doing it, and then coming back and telling them, right? So that was kind of one aspect. And then the other aspect was as we got closer to this idea of we needed the IPO to fund the phase 3, a very large
Yeah,
phase 3
absolutely.
outcome study that was unusual for a small company to undertake.
Yeah.
We went to the board, and the board was still, active investors, if you will. And so they sat there and said, we'll support the IPO, et cetera, as many boards do. And we took the approach back to them of saying, that's great, but we actually want evidence of this.
Put your money where your mouth
Put
is.
your money where put your money where
Exactly.
your mouth is. And so we actually ended up having, money put in escrow, purchase agreements signed. And it's interesting because that was the point where we got really lucky. My CEO had the guts to be able to guide us, and don't get me wrong.
There's some gall there,
there was, both of us contributed to the idea and whatnot. But as a CFO, you're looking to the CEO of like, you've got my back on this,
Exactly.
right? We're going down together on
You're
this.
not
right?
throwing me under the bus when I leave the room,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
And so we sat there, and it turned out that structure that we had, frankly dreamed up, and that council had to validate, as to how to handle it. Turns out there's securities law that actually defines when you have that structure, it has to be disclosed on the cover of your prospectus. So it was the best marketing in the world that when you went out to actually start your roadshow, and you'd have the usual dance of, okay, how much are you raising? You're raising 75 million. Are your insiders there? Yeah, they are. And they kind of roll their eyes, and it's like, no, here's the latest prospectus. Look, and that changed the whole dynamic. That while the rest of the financial world and equity markets were extremely volatile and uncertain, we had a certain amount of certainty, if you will, that other companies just didn't have.
Yeah, no, and I mean, to your point, you're on the heels of the global financial crisis, having that sort of backing. I mean, your insiders could have just said, no, you're crazy. Go about it the normal way, right? But you guys were really trailblazers in this approach. But I mean, it could have gone either way, right? What were the kind of signs of success or failure? Was it a little dicey at times?
Absolutely. Look, it was dicey for a couple of reasons, because at the time, so we had phase 2 data in hand. We knew the phase 3 study had to be huge. And so we had some biobucks deals on the table.
Yep.
And, we were fortunate that the management team had an exit or two at that point, some success. And I give our board a lot of credit, because we forced them into an uncomfortable spot. And, again, in my experience, usually when you force, investors into uncomfortable places, they don't respond.
It could go either way.
It could go either way, yeah. And this board actually did respond. There were absolutely some challenging conversations, and that all culminated with, this is why this is the right approach. And it was because this was the path to take kind of the multi-billion-dollar swing, is the way we looked at it. And fortunately, they took it, the same way ultimately, and looked at it from a portfolio theory point of view of, this is why we invested in this company, was, not to get a phase 2 biobucks deal, but to see if we can, get the home run.
I like to call it the go big or go home approach. That's I think I need to put that above my front door of my house, but my kids at least know about it.
Amen. That's good. Exactly.
So I guess, no, that was an amazing story. And I mean, for some folks, one IPO is a career milestone, right? And doing it 5 times over, doing it in the way that you did, that's not a one-size-fits-all capital raising approach, right? I can think of probably a dozen companies in our portfolio right now where if the C-suite went to the board members and they said, hey, we're going to need you to put your money where your mouth is, they would have a slightly different conversation.
Right.
So let's transition then back to Nusano. When we started talking about the company, one, I've never seen you more excited about an opportunity, so I could feel the enthusiasm. And when we were starting the conversations, you were going to disrupt the pharmaceutical industry, the drug manufacturing process, but Nusano's become so much more than that. You've got 4 verticals now. Do you want to dive into, those 4 major areas?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I describe Nusano as a physics company
Hmm.
first and foremost. So we've actually got a suite of technologies. All of them are homegrown. And as I tell folks, we don't change the laws of physics, but we do execute them at a level of efficiency that, candidly, people didn't think was possible.
Wow.
So we've got our, as we call our alpha facility, which is our primary isotope production facility. I won't give you the exact dollar amount, but I will say it's well into 9 figures is the cost.
Yeah. Yeah. And how many tons of concrete?
So 162,000 metric tons.
Okay, so I was thinking it was in the 25,000 ton range. It's gotten a little bit
162,000.
bigger since then.
It's gotten, yeah, and so it's built on 688 pillars that go about 80 feet deep, because Salt Lake is basically it's a sandy former lake bottom, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we need that for geological stability.
Oh, absolutely.
And because this isotope production manufacturing is just incredibly precise. And so we've designed a facility that will, in a 7.0 earthquake,
Yeah.
will actually move less than 1 millimeter. And the whole facility will move as one during that.
Oh my
so
gosh.
in theory, hence the caveats, in theory, production would continue through a 7.0 earthquake uninterrupted,
right?
Which is kind of mind blowing.
So basically, your employees have no excuse to stop working in an earthquake. Just get back to work.
Now you're reading my mind. Yes, now you're reading my mind. It's like, I don't want to hear about natural disasters. Let's go.
Just go with the flow.
Let's go.
Feel the wave and get back to work.
I tell my team all the time, I've only got so many beats in this heart on this earth, so let's go. I'm burning daylight here. But that core technology. Well, going back a couple of years ago, we realized that we were developing technologies in-house to complement and to make our isotope production more efficient, which was great. But that those technologies had real applications in the world. And what you come to realize is that while the isotopes are such a foundational ingredient to many oncology therapies, and we can talk about that, it's the isotopes don't really care what they're used for. They're actually used in a lot of different ways, from oil and gas pipelines to satellites to weapons guidance systems, and then also in energy as well. We're going to get into HALEU production, the low enriched uranium, that will enable this nuclear renaissance. But also when we talk about like SMRs, kind of the modular reactors, there's a shortage. There's a shortage of the fuel. There's uncertainty. And you talk to just about any, SMR producer, and they've kind of slow played some of their development because why rush to market if there's a lack of fuel?
And for our audience, SMR
is a small modular reactor.
Got it.
So it's the idea that anywhere, it varies in terms of power, but in theory, it should be something, think of it as a portable generator on steroids.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely.
And so with hindsight, a great example to me is with hindsight, think of the Permian Basin in Texas when that was developed. And that really was probably the critical stress point of the Texas grid that, has become so, well known today.
Yeah.
With hindsight, if you had developed that area with these, modular reactors and kept the most of the strain of energy off of that grid, we wouldn't be talking about the Texas grid as though it was a risk, because that power would have been centralized. Same thing when we think about all these data centers popping up.
Right, yeah.
In a perfect world, the data center has its own dedicated power source.
Absolutely.
And these modular reactors are perfect to basically create almost like a daisy chain of nonstop power, abundant power.
So it's not a cooling source of the generators, because that's, or the servers, because that's another big component. But you're keeping those up and running potentially if the grid crashes or there are other disruptions in power.
You're exactly right.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's made. Okay, so we've got pharmaceuticals, we've got energy production, oil and gas pipelines, we've got satellite, aerospace, and defense. I'm trying to think. There was another vertical I feel like I'm missing.
Yeah, so within aerospace and defense, and then there's the batteries.
Okay. Yes, the
So
batteries. There
so
we
the
go.
cool part, is that, like, I'll give you an example in satellites and batteries. I'm going to use batteries and heat sources as kind of synonymously. So the current generation of satellites, and whether these are like the miniature, and we're literally talking like 18 inches square type
Oh,
thing.
wow. Yeah.
That's the size of a lot of these satellites that go up that are low Earth orbit,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. But a limitation to those, for example, as to why we can't go explore the dark side of the moon, is the temperature drops to minus 200,
Yeah.
and the equipment is not developed for it.
Right. It'll freeze.
So what we can do is we can actually take a very interesting isotope, and I'll leave the name out of it, just in case, just in case it is national defense. I don't know.
Yeah.
But we can take a very interesting isotope and we can enrich it to a very powerful level. And what that does is it allows the satellite producer to use a smaller amount of this isotope as a heat source, and it will allow them to be able to have missions that go not just to the moon, to the dark side, but to Mars, to deep space,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And then we also, again, this is where we get into, we have a very specialized facility out here in Salt Lake, and we'll actually produce some of the heat sources as well as the battery packs that will actually power these things. Now, the batteries we're not going to produce in high
Right.
volume,
Yeah.
but what we are going to do is perfect the technology here. We'll produce, if you're a satellite producer and you need one or two a month, we can do that.
That's fine. Yeah.
But if for broader applications, this is going to be a big enabler, for other applications, both simple and very complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so you don't have to build the whole mousetrap, but you can build the power source. You can build the furnace, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty incredible. And for a company like yours, I mean, you had 10 employees at this time last year, and you're well over 500 now, and you're diving into some sectors that have some really big players and established players, as well as others that have deep pockets that can enter into it. I mean, how do you ensure that you don't go too broad and too thin too early versus cementing your stronghold in certain sectors first?
Did my team ask you to ask me that?
No, I swear.
No, it's that's the question that's the burden.
Yeah.
And then I go back to what I learned as a CFO, is that burden of kind of knowing when to poke your nose in, when not to. So, part of my job is to kind of read the room. I mean,
Yeah.
I've the talent on my team is ridiculous. I mean, these people aren't just really smart physicists and engineers.
Yeah.
These are like best in class in their particular field.
Yeah.
And so a common trait for them is that, guess what? They're not just used to winning. They're
Yeah.
used to perfection.
Uh-huh.
And, and obviously as you go from development to production of anything, that's kind of a trade-off of like, well, I don't need to launch with perfection. I just need to start getting some real world experience.
Yeah.
So, so we kind of, we go back and forth, and it's my job, along with some key members of my team, to be able to balance that.
Yeah.
And also to be able to look for the synergy of, if I'm advancing a particular, piece of technology,
Yeah.
the idea that I can commercialize it in 3 different ways, well, that's almost invisible to the technical side.
Of course.
And that's where I go back to, the isotopes don't care what they're used for.
True.
And frankly,
Yeah.
neither does the team. What the team wants to know is that we're making the isotopes, that we're making them to the spec needed,
Yeah.
and that we're doing them in the time we, promise, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, and for lack of a better term, you developed a platform, right?
Yeah.
And that platform can have number of use cases. And, in some cases, the capital sources that's funding all of these endeavors, they have a hard time appreciating that big vision, right? Have you run into, look, I know you were at the White House last week,
Yeah.
and I'm sure there are elements of that are, require a certain level of clearance. But, tell us about, that meeting and, what you can share, and, what sort of asks did they have of you? Because, when you're talking about uranium, you're talking about geopolitical risks, you're talking about local supply chain. This is a very U.S. centric, administration. So, what went on in the White House behind closed doors?
Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal experience for sure. Look, for Nusano, we create a domestic supply chain. We of isotopes.
Yeah.
Check. That gets us off of dependence of starting material coming from Russia, coming from China. Some of the isotopes we produce are actually would be considered rare earth isotopes. So when the media thinks about like rare earth minerals, we focus on a pick digging things out of the ground and let me find it.
Yeah.
The reality is that the end form of that is often gas or liquid, and that's what we're producing in some of these cases. So so as a result, folks in Washington are very interested, as you said, geopolitically of like, wait a second, you're going to start producing here in a few months, how much and what can you do, et cetera.
And what was the name of your company again?
Exactly. No, serious. Yeah. And then, then you throw in that we've, hired a few folks and these are good paying jobs, technical jobs, homegrown.
Yeah.
And then you kind of piece that out with, all of this has been privately funded.
Yeah.
We're like the poster child for what I would say, not just this administration, but many members of government want to be fair. I met with the White House in the prior administration as well.
Yep.
So, the conversation in this go around did say it was with primarily with the Energy Dominance Council, which is actually a subset of the cabinet. I mean, it's like 2/3 of the cabinet.
Right.
So it's kind of humbling, the team that you're meeting with. And I will tell you this, we went in, we spoke mostly about our HALEU production, the low enriched uranium, as well as the ability to recycle spent fuel rods coming out of nuclear reactors. Something that, to my knowledge, nobody else is able to do at scale.
Yeah, similar concerns for lithium batteries that are accumulating that have been completely exhausted. Yeah.
And so I will tell you, that meeting was like 45, 50 minutes, and it was one of the most productive meetings I've ever had in my life. Literally while we're in that room, I had, we quickly drafted language of the ask, and I'll tell you about the ask in a second. They connected me to CEOs of people that will become customers of us, that they just said, wow, you should talk to the CEO of this utility. They were just in here the other day lamenting this challenge. Yeah. And so here, let me connect. And they're connecting me right there on the spot, via text.
Oh my gosh. They didn't use Telegram this time?
Yeah, they didn't. Exactly. I know they're really getting modern and utilizing the right platform. Let's call it.
No, got it.
And so it's just amazing how how quickly they want to move things forward.
Yeah.
And one thing
which isn't always what you hear about government, right? That's kind of
and
it's
and that was they prepped me for the meeting.
Yeah,
and they said, hey Chris, just so you're aware, if you say something is going to take a year, they're going to say, well, why can't you do it in 3 months?
This is the government we're talking about.
This is the government and our government, to be clear. Yeah,
well, exactly.
and I laughed and I was like, that's how I run my company. I get that from our research group all the time.
Exactly.
Like, we can do that in about 18 months. I'm like, well, what if you had like 6 months? What would it look like?
Hypothetically, if we need to do it in half of that.
Hypothetically. Yeah. And so, it was really just amazing. And I'll just touch on one last thing there in terms of the ask. We're not going there looking for a handout,
right?
Like so many companies are. And and I think the perspective that government misses sometimes, just government in general, is that there's other things like permitting, things like access to land, because look, while most of our facility is right there in Salt Lake City,
right?
When it comes to uranium and production, I'm not going to be making that in, just south of the airport.
Right.
We want that to be in a secure facility.
Absolutely.
That's behind walls, fences, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And so I need government engagement on that. And look, I'm ready to start building that facility like right now.
That's incredible.
The technology will be ready by the end of, in about 12 months, and we'll be producing at least dribbles by the end of 26.
Oh my gosh.
And that's like somewhere between 2 to 4 years sooner than, I think what most people expected was possible. So,
that's pretty incredible. And obviously asking the controversial question: is this a Doge change? Do you think if you went back, let's call it several months ago, or a few years ago, would you have had that same level of receptivity without something like Doge? Or is there an element of FOMO of you guys have done this on your own with private capital, and the government, there's some egos involved, and they want to be a part of the Nusano growth story and energy independence and local production and, funding U.S. jobs?
Yeah, I think, look, I think I'm pretty good at reading people, whether
Yeah.
whether it's over, whether it's over TV or whether it's in person.
Absolutely.
And we saw, the first time President Trump in his administration, and I think, at least in my analysis, I think if you put him under a lie detector test, he would have regrets about not moving quick enough on certain things because, with that experience, you realize that, yeah, it's a 4-year term, but the reality is that the midterms are kind of a tipping point. And so now you sit there and go, oh, well, it's really a 2-year term.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you're like, oh, well, it takes me a year to really, and now all of a sudden you have like 1 year as president.
It's like an IPO. It's like, okay, you want to go public, then let's work backwards to what you need to do. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so I think, I mean, candidly, I think Doge kind of, it's like those snow globes that just shook everything up.
Yeah.
And look, disruption is nerve-wracking for
True.
a lot of folks.
Yeah.
I won't get into kind of how it was rolled out. There's clearly opportunities where they could have improved there. But the concept of change and the concept of disrupting people is, to me, that's when you get the best thinking from people and you get the problem solving. So I think it was a little bit of that. And I do think it was a little bit of lessons learned from the first go around of like, I need to move quick if I want to do, if I want to have any of these things stick. So it's a very interesting, I will tell you this, I've had probably no fewer than 6 or 8 Uber drivers in DC over the last 3 months.
Yeah.
And all of them a comment on how the energy in the city is so different than any time in their last 10 or 20 years, even in the first administration. And the one Uber driver that I've remembered very clearly, he said, the energy is such that everybody wants to be here. Whether you agree or disagree, it's a place that you need to be.
Yeah.
And he was commenting because he was saying how much better business is for him.
No, it's true.
So I don't know. I think it's all those things rolled into
So
one.
they aren't all investigative reporters?
To my knowledge, I have not tripped over any investigative reporters, but who knows?
I feel like for a bit, most of my Uber drivers were giving me crypto tips, and I'm like, maybe, just get me there in a reasonable amount of time.
Exactly.
But, well, I think that's a great segue. You talk about problem solving. You talk about critical thinking. I'm a big advocate for role modeling attributes of individuals and, really shaping myself off of folks that are successful, not as a total person, right? Because some people are great public speakers, other people are great salespeople, others are emotionally intelligent. Talk a little bit more about, the qualities that you have role modeled and that have, paid dividends in your career.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, the first one that I truly go back to, I worked for Philips for a good number of years, primarily out of school. And I was basically like a staff supporter, to a division general manager. Pretty big job.
Yeah.
Eventually I would get to sit in on his staff meetings and do whatever, right? Take notes, whatever it took. And I would listen, I would observe how he interacted. I mean, because he was a smart guy. There was no doubt.
Oh, yeah.
But yet of his, I forget if it was like 7 or 8 product line managers or general managers, there were clearly a couple that were, candidly just in the wrong job. Let's politely say they were in the wrong job.
That's about as politely as you can say it.
And yet I watched him, and no matter what they were saying, he was always, number one, respectful, and number two, he listened, gave them the forum, and then he would explain why he was going to do something different, if he did something different. So that was kind of the first time, and I've always tried to take that characteristic of, the environment of listen, be respectful, and then explain why you're doing something. And if somebody's still upset, then that's kind of, they need to work on that.
Yeah.
And, and that's, I mean, I could digress into the challenges of, today's society that, we seem compelled to react to everything like right this instant, right?
Yes.
And, which is just crazy to me.
I know.
And that's probably the segue. I mean, the second one I learned along the way was, in essence, make a decision when you have to.
Yeah.
And some people confuse that with, I'm not going to make a decision.
Or being impulsive.
Or being impulsive.
Yeah.
And the reality is that sometimes the decision you think you need to make today, 3 days later, the decision may have different facts or circumstances. You as a company may be more desperate. You as a company may not be as desperate. Your customer may have had time to sit and think, oh, well, maybe we don't have to do it this way. Maybe we can do it that way. So a lot of varieties, like that. And I think that concept, that kind of blends into the critical thinking side.
Yeah.
And then, the last one is the CEO that I alluded to during that 2009 IPO. I mean, he truly taught me that he challenged my out of the box thinking.
Yeah.
And, and to me, that's a combination of confidence, but it's also a combination of being willing to measure time versus risk. And by that, I just mean, if you're going to take, 3 months to make something perfect.
Right.
And the alternative is I could move forward today and you admit you're like, I'm probably like 85-90% certain.
Right.
There's times, look, if I'm at the Boeing production plant, I don't want to do that.
No,
right?
You don't need any more air plugs flying off a plane.
I don't need, that's a bad risk reward.
Yes, yeah.
But if if it's around, advancing technology development and getting it into beta testing, that might not be a bad trade-off. If the industry you're in has a first mover advantage, et cetera, et cetera. So, to me, I mean, we used to joke about, here's the box and here's me, I mean, but that was really the third thing and so that's the piece that I took from him. And, I think he would find it very entertaining that, 15 years later that I still reference those moments and all that. Yeah.
And it's the analogies of, whether it's perfection is the enemy of good enough or paralysis by analysis, right? It's take the information that you have, understand the risk tolerance that you have, and, make a decision based on the facts and circumstances. And when you're factoring in that risk tolerance, you are hopefully knowing that this is something that we could break and then tweak and fix. Yeah. So I think that first mover advantage, especially in such a disruptive space that you guys are in, is super critical.
Yeah.
You talked about being around some of the smartest people in the room, right? And I think when you're dealing with some of those folks, once again, you have egos involved. You have folks that may be consumed by titles and they want to have a title that they feel is it exemplifies their, educational background and all their years of service. And, I always go back to, Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, where he talks about get all of the right people on the bus and then figure out the roles. How have you done that at Nusano? And when you have those, it's that balancing act, right, of high individual contributors and then great team players. How do you create that harmony between what can be two potentially disparate audiences?
Yeah, it is a balancing act, to be honest. And so, you come across people that my kind of people, if you will, are the ones, that when you're talking to them, you've connected and they tell you, I honestly don't care what my title is.
Seriously.
And that has the right mind, I'm here to solve a problem. And that's what you realize, especially as small scaling companies, you're there for a team effort, for a mutual purpose, et cetera. So that's one aspect. Now, the nuance to that is I sometimes force them into that conversation because I do believe in titles with a purpose.
Agreed.
And by that, if you're customer facing, let's face it, certain titles get certain credibility in the field. If you're in pitching to investors, et cetera, you can't just walk in and say, what's your title?
They're not taking the meeting unless
what's
you're...
your title? I don't have, they're not taking the meeting unless, unless you've checked some box.
Yeah.
So there is kind of that piece. Now, The other aspect of that is, kind of it's a beaten analogy, but the best athlete available.
Yeah.
I've used that so many times. And, times where sometimes you come across people and you're just like so impressed with kind of how they carry themselves, how they think through a problem, how they communicate.
Yeah.
And you're just sitting there going, I would just love that. And, and look, I've done that many times. I did that. Done that just in the last 6 months.
Oh, yeah.
Where where the person who's leading the strategic planning for the energy vertical, I was referred to her by somebody that I entrust implicitly.
Yeah.
And the person said, you need to talk to her. She's just really impressive. She's right there in Salt Lake. But I just didn't have a role,
Right.
for her skill set. And over the course of at least 4 months, we kind of spoke on and off. We talked, and each time I came away and I'm like, God, I really, really like her.
Yeah.
She's going to fit in. This is part of the thinking this company needs. And finally, I just
Figure
said,
it out.
yeah, finally, literally like a couple days before Christmas, I said, how's your tolerance for ambiguity?
Yeah.
I said, are you cool just coming on board? And I'm pretty sure that if you help me enable a few of these projects, that it's going to be screamingly obvious in
Yeah.
3 or 4 months, as to what your title, role, et cetera, should be. And she had the right attitude. She didn't flinch. She's like, honestly, I don't care if you give me a title. I just want to be a part of this mission.
Yeah.
And that's when I knew, and I was like, then let's get the paperwork going. We'll have it to you by New Year's. So yeah, sometimes it truly is about the people. And I can tell you, I've never once been let down in my life
Yeah.
by trusting your gut on the people connection and that idea of, I don't know where you're going to fit, I just know you're going to fit.
Yeah.
Type approach.
And that gut, and maybe taking this analogy a little bit too far, those probiotics that are built up in your gut over years of experience in different roles, and frankly, learning from mistakes and other things, your gut becomes pretty dialed in.
It does, and you got to check yourself, right?
Yeah.
You got to make sure you're not drinking your own Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
And kind of try to play devil's advocate from time to time and all that. But no, I'm totally with you. Totally.
Yeah,
with you.
no, I mean, being a father of four, I'm constantly, I just check my ego at the door, and I'll learn from my kids. I have to sometimes try a different approach with each of them. Same thing's true in work. It doesn't matter about titles. I can learn from a junior associate, just like I can learn from one of my peers at the firm. And we've got our team on site in Salt Lake this week, and we've got a lot of current and former college and professional athletes on the team. And there's been a lot of football analogies, but at the end of the day, you don't really care, who scored the touchdown. You care that you won the game and it was a team effort, right?
Yeah.
And so I think keeping the eye on the prize is so critical, especially for a company like yours, which is changing the world. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this next question, which is obviously investors and customers all care about the business side of the house, those four verticals. Now the government is very focused on that. With taking 250 companies public, we oftentimes see that accounting, finance, systems, processes can be the long pole in the tent, but often the most neglected part of a business. While you're scaling and growing and hiring, how have you kept the lights on that side of the house, and just making sure that you don't have that deferred maintenance list growing out of control?
Yeah, absolutely. No. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, I've been one of your customers over the years as well.
Several companies.
There's a couple of partners that we trust implicitly to do exactly that and to get us there. And I think kind of the extension of that is, you also have some people that you trust over time.
Yeah.
And so look, our chief accounting officer that we have, at Nusano, somebody that I've worked with before, that I've seen him, do the impossible.
Yeah.
And that builds up, credibility, so that when he, when he came to me, gosh, 18 months ago and said, I know you don't want to hear this, but we really need to start thinking about implementing a real ERP
Yeah.
system. And, and you're sitting there, you're in the midst of, building this behemoth in the desert.
Right.
You're trying to scale up
You're like, I have
employees.
100 metric tons
you
of
know,
concrete to worry about,
Yeah,
man.
exactly. Yeah, the revenue, which by the way, we should have gotten into the concrete business because
I know.
the price
Yeah.
of concrete over the course of this project,
Oh, yeah.
it went up like almost 3x. I'm like,
Inflation is real.
all
Yeah.
we're trying to do is save some lives,
Could
man.
have done some
And-
financial instruments and buy
exactly.
forwards in concrete
Seriously,
and sand.
yeah. If there were forwards on concrete, that would have
Yeah.
made sense. But and so when he comes to you and says, "Hey, you gotta start planning. You gotta be planning for the future on the systems." And this isn't just about passing an audit. This is about making it seamless for the customer.
Yeah.
And so you got to bite the bullet, and you do those things. And so I try to make sure that you've always got pillars of people that you can who have been through the battles
Yeah. Built
and
for scale.
yeah, and then augment with folks that are getting new opportunities, because that's how I got here, was, people along the way saying, yeah, I know you haven't actually done this, but I think you can actually do this.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, it's a little bit of both, for sure.
Well, and that's great advice because, I deal with CFOs and aspiring CFOs, so controllers that either are looking to be in a CFO role or a head of finance role in their next opportunity. And oftentimes, it's almost just dead on arrival. Oh, you haven't been a CFO previously. Why don't you get your first CFO role, and then we can talk and see if you're a fit for our type of company. Same thing could be said to you as well. How did you build that confidence in the early founders and investors at Nusano to say, hey, I may have not been a CEO in a past life or in one of my previous roles, but I've been around the block a bit and I've worked with some amazing CEOs. I know what I'm talking about and I know I can be successful in this role.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, actually. The way this opportunity came about, Verily was one of my largest investors at a prior company.
Yeah.
And it was actually one of the partners there who after we transacted the prior company, he said, we've got this other thing in our portfolio that we really think highly of,
Yeah.
but you could probably use a little business direction.
Yeah.
And that was really how it started. So, I at least had the benefit of there was already somebody who kind of said, hey, you don't have to change who you are.
Exactly.
This is a good fit. Now, the rest of the process, the rest of the interview journey, if you will, was absolutely as you describe, of like,
Yep.
how am I, why am I not going to be overwhelmed by X, how big can we make this? And it was interesting because every time I kind of spoke to somebody about this technology and, the problems that it was solving, I came away realizing that the market wasn't, small. It was huge.
Yeah.
And so then it changed my mindset of, okay, now how do you meter this out in a thoughtful way? And how do you kind of ensure that culture of ROI, gets translated in this highly technical world that we're in? So it was really kind of those two activities that kept me going.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we're kind of wrapping up our time. I think there's a couple more questions. One, just selfishly, you and I are both golfers. You have a very demanding role as the CEO of Nusano. You advise other companies, other advisory firms. How are you finding time for everything? How do you find time to golf? What's this work-life balance that folks aspire for?
Yeah. I mean, work-life balance is I think it's a bad direction to go down, to be honest, because you're forcing, square pegs into round holes. And the reality is that if you're a high performer in whatever you do, I don't care if you're running the best lemonade stand or you're running a Fortune 500 company, you are a high performer. And so it is a 24/7, type of activity. Now, it's incumbent upon you to find that moment of what your trigger is to manage stress,
Yeah.
to enjoy life, to make sure life doesn't pass you by. And whether that's, 10 minutes of meditation or whatever. I never used to work out in the morning.
Hmm.
I now work out pretty religiously at like 5 or 5:30 every
Oh,
morning
yeah.
because it's pretty much the only time that I know my day is going to be interrupted.
Absolutely.
And so, I take the same approach with golf.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have the, walk out there and say, I am playing 18 holes today. If I've got time to go take 20 swings on the
Yeah.
driving range, if that's all I have time for, what I know about golf, just like in business, there needs to be a thoughtfulness
Yeah.
and a lack of a rush and a
Yeah.
panic.
Yeah.
And the two, it wasn't always like this with my golf game, but the two have kind of helped to feed each other now of like, there is a certain calmness that you need to be
Yeah.
successful with both of them. And right now they seem to be feeding. If I could putt a little bit better, I could really start to be scary, but the two are feeding off each other, I think, in a pretty productive manner.
I mean, I like to say that I'm in a perpetual state of imbalance.
Yeah.
Because it's a dynamic balancing act on any given day.
Yeah.
Mike Tyson's quote of everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, I feel like I get punched in the face every morning when I wake up. What fires am I putting out?
Yeah.
Who needs my attention right now? But you're right. It's you have to trust your gut. Once again, going back to your other analogy, and frankly, most of the pros on the tour are changing putters, even if they've won multiple times on the tour in one season. So
that's insane to me. I mean, that's insane to me. And what was it at the PGA? Like 50 drivers got disqualified, and I'm like, if you took my driver away, I think I'd be a little rattled by that, But that's why I have a day job.
It's true. I know. We will keep our day jobs until we're maybe on the senior tour one day.
There you go.
All right. My last question that I'll ask is, success comes with trade-offs, right? If you had a chance to do it all over again, would you do everything the same, or would you make any changes in how you've done what you've done to get you where you are today?
It's
a doozy to end on.
It is. It's a good man. We have to take a nap after that
my
question.
My coworkers told me I need a hook at the end, and so this is going to be my hook.
Look, for me, there's no regrets that, I always had the ability to trust, to make judgments of trusting people along the way. I remember when Phillips wanted to move me from California to Texas initially. And I remember my boss at the time, she leaned over to me on this giant ops review and she goes, "It's Texas. Are you sure?" Because I volunteered, right?
You're like, where in Texas?
And I just looked at it as, hey, if they're saying this is good for my career, I'm in.
Yeah.
And so all those doors, and there's plenty of challenges along the way and, failures or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
They've led to where I am today. So I feel good in that regard. I think, if you had to do it over again, I mean, there's times where it's easy to become wrapped up in what you're doing. And, now, right now I'm, I don't know, I'm 10 or 11 days on the road.
Yeah.
And it would be, and I think with hindsight, there's times you would look back on it and go, the world probably would have kept spinning had
I planned that a little bit better.
Had you just waited. And, and that's something that you learn along the way. Hopefully I'm smarter about that today than I was, 10 years ago. And, and again, going back to the work-life balance for a second, you got to realize that as a leader, it's not about me. Mm-hmm. It's about what style of person you are that I'm trying to put in a position to succeed.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's definitely tweaks that, of course, that I would probably make. But it's also relevant to say I need to make sure that I'm staying acutely aware of your needs within reason, if you will. So that's the way I would look at it.
Yeah, I like to say that I don't have any regrets in my career. I've made a lot of mistakes that I feel like I've learned from, and I feel like that informs my decision-making process going forward.
I like that.
But Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. I couldn't think of anyone better to have as the guest on the inaugural Connor Group Breakthrough Work podcast. We're really excited to see what you're building at Nusano. We're excited to partner with you as a client, and yeah, can't wait to see what the future holds in store.
I appreciate being a guest, and I look forward to hosting you out of the facility. I promise you there's nothing else like it on the planet, and truly appreciate your partnership as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
All right.